My name's Travis, and today I'm going to explain to you how overdrive works. We're talking about distortion, whether it's from a pedal like this Timmy pedal, one of my favorites, or whether it's distortion from your amp or from a plugin. We're going to talk about how do you get a distorted sound at a low volume and what is the correlation between your guitar, the pedal, the amp or the plugin, and what eventually comes out of the speaker. The reason I want to make this video is that so often I will have a new student over Zoom, and in the lesson I'll say to them, hey, go to your amp and turn up the overdrive, get a more distorted sound. And they go back to their amp and they're like, oh, it's so loud, it's so loud. Whenever I turn it up, it explodes and it disturbs all my neighbors. Well, I'm going to clear all that up for you today in this lesson. To understand how overdrive works, we first have to understand the history of amplifiers. Back in the day, we only had one type of amplifier. It was an amplifier just like this, and it only had one volume knob. As you see here on this channel, there's only one volume knob. So to get a distorted sound back in the day, they had to plug into the amp and turn up the volume all the way. And that's how they got overdrive. Here's what that sounds like. When the amp is turned to 10, level 10 in volume, and my guitar's volume is turned to 10, right? The volume of the pickups, I'm getting the most amount of distortion that I can between this guitar and this amp with a single cable. If I turn down the volume on my guitar, then two things happen. The amount of distortion, the amount of I'm getting gets lower, and the volume gets lower. They're related, right? They're related. Think about it like water pressure. The volume that's coming out of your guitar is like how much water pressure is coming out of a faucet in your house. So if you turn up the water in your house all the way, like crank it up as fast as it'll go, it'll come out like, right? It sounds loud, it looks all distorted, the water is bubbly, right? That's exactly how this is. If you lower the amount of water coming out of your tap, the volume of it gets lower, right? It sounds less like shh, and then it becomes like nice and smooth, and the bubbles go down, it becomes a nice clear stream. That's exactly how this works. We're gonna now talk about pedals, but pedals operate the exact same way. It's the exact same relationship. So if you're trying to adjust all of your volumes on, an amp and a pedal and this and that, but your guitar's volume is on 0 or 1 or 2, it's not gonna interact the same way as if your guitar's volume was on 10, right? And it gets even more complicated if you have two pickups like this guitar and maybe you've selected both and one is low and one is high. For that reason, I just want to say that most guitar players run their guitar close to 10. So you should be running it from like level 7 and higher on your guitar. Just as a generalization, start there and you can mess with it later to get different tones. So people were annoyed that to get a distorted sound, they had to take their amp and crank it up all the way to 10 because that was too loud. And they didn't want a little tiny amp because then that was too quiet. They wanted to have control. So what they developed was the master volume amp. Just like this one. What we have here is the volume output, just like that amp had. So if I went like this and covered that up, it would be just like the last amp I just showed you. There's just one volume knob that controls everything. But what they did is they put in this circuit, which is how much overdrive there is. So what this does is control that sound that you heard. This just controls how much of it that you want. How much overdrive do you want? And then the second channel, the master volume, controls the overall volume. So now they're independent. This is an overdrive pedal. Think about this pedal just like an amp. It works just like an amp. There's a volume knob and a gain knob. This is the main source of confusion that people have when they're messing with their pedal or their amp. Remember, this is just like an amplifier. It's the same thing. It functions the same way. The problem is that the volume and the overdrive or distortion or whatever they're calling it, this can be called gain, overdrive, distortion. Both of these two things affect volume. Volume obviously affects volume. It's how much volume there is. But this guy happens first. It goes gain and then volume. Don't be confused about the order of the things. Don't be confused about treble and bass. Just ignore these two right now. It always goes in here, into your gain, and then your master volume, right? Whether it's an amp or a pedal. So the reason people get confused is that they'll turn this knob, and though it increases distortion, it also increases volume, right? So then they might be used to using their pedal always with the gain very low and their volume very high, and it's already too loud. And so when they start to turn up their distortion, it becomes unbearably loud for them, but they don't compensate by lowering volume. And I know this is for some of you, this is such a basic thing, but I see this so often that people don't understand this. So that's why I wanted to make this video. So If you want more gain, you have to compensate. If you want the volume to to be the same, as you increase gain, you'll have to lower the volume. And this is further complicated by people using their guitar's volume at varying levels. If you're messing with all this stuff and your guitar volume is at like 2 or 1 and not at 10, when you turn up your guitar volume, all of this is going to get crazier. Like, you might turn the gain all the way up and the volume like this because you're like, oh, I'm not getting a lot of overdrive. Is this the most amount of overdrive I can get? It's because your guitar's volume is on 1 or 2. And then when you turn that up, this is going to go insane. So always set your pedals and your amp with your guitar at like 10 or 9 or 7, right? So the way people use amps now very commonly is they'll use a completely clean amp. So that amp is totally clean. It's not getting any overdrive. It's doing nothing to my sound. So it's going guitar into here, into a clean amp. And all of my overdrive is being controlled here. Does that make sense? If you have a smaller amp or your amp has some overdrive in it, then you have 2 levels of overdrive. You got overdrive going on in here, you got overdrive in your amp. So your guitar's volume affects how much overdrive you get, whether it's here or there. That's the trifecta of how overdrive works and how it's related to your guitar's volume, to the pedal, to the amp. Hope that made sense. Thanks for watching.